In September 2021, Netflix released a 9-episode Korean drama with a modest marketing push and no major international stars. Within a month, it had become the platform's most-watched series ever. To understand why Squid Game worked, you have to look past the violence and the viral moments and look at what the show is actually built on. Director Hwang Dong-hyuk wrote the original script back in 2009. For over a decade, every studio he pitched it to turned it down. They called it too disturbing, too unrealistic. That rejection matters because it tells you something about the timing. The show wasn't made for 2009. It was made for a world that hadn't yet lived through a decade of rising household debt, stagnant wages, and widening inequality. By 2021, the premise wasn't unrealistic anymore. It was recognizable. Hwang has said in interviews that he wrote the first draft while going through his own financial struggles, and you can feel that lived-in frustration in how the show treats money, not as an abstract stake but as something suffocating. Structurally, Squid Game is a survival thriller. 456 players compete in childhood games, and elimination means death. But the games are never the point. They're the mechanism. What the show is actually examining is what desperation does to people when the stakes are high enough. Every player enters the game because the systems outside it, debt, work, family, healthcare, have already failed them. The genius of the format is that it takes an abstract economic argument and makes it visceral. You don't have to understand macroeconomics to feel what's happening when a character chooses between another human being's life and their own survival. It's worth pausing on the character work here, because that's what actually makes the premise land emotionally rather than just conceptually. Song Ji-hun isn't written as a conventional hero. He's flawed, impulsive, and often makes selfish choices before he makes selfless ones. That matters. If the show had given us a clean protagonist, the games would feel like plot devices. Because Ji-hun is messy and human, his choices under pressure feel like genuine moral tests rather than scripted heroics. The same is true of Sang-woo, whose arc essentially functions as the show's thesis in miniature. A brilliant, respected man who reveals exactly how thin the line is between social success and moral collapse once survival is actually on the line. This is also why the show traveled so well internationally. Class anxiety and debt aren't uniquely Korean problems. Hwang was drawing from South Korea's specific economic pressures, a hyper-competitive, credit-driven culture, but the emotional logic translated instantly to audiences in the US, Brazil, India, and dozens of other countries dealing with their own versions of the same squeeze. That's rarer than it sounds. Most shows this culturally specific don't cross over this cleanly. Compare it to other entries in the survival game genre Battle Royale, The Hunger Games, which mostly used the format for spectacle or dystopian world-building. Squid Game is the rare version that keeps its focus tightly on the present, ordinary economic reality of its audience, rather than an imagined future. That grounding is a big part of why it hit differently. Then there's the visual language, which deserves real credit for the show's virality. The production design deliberately clashes childlike, pastel-colored sets against extreme violence. The pink guard uniforms, the geometric masks, the giant doll from red light, green light. These are simple, high-contrast images that read instantly, even out of context. That's not an accident. It's what made the show so easy to meme, recreate, and reference, which fed the algorithm-driven discovery loop just as much as word of mouth did. A show can have a brilliant script and still fail to break through online if it doesn't give people something instantly shareable. Squid Game solved both problems at once. The numbers back up how unusual this run was. Squid Game topped Netflix charts in over 90 countries and became the platform's biggest series launch at the time. It went on to win multiple Emmys, becoming the first non-English language series to do so in major categories, along with SAG Awards recognition for its cast. A milestone that mattered beyond the trophy itself, since it signaled a real shift in how English language award bodies were engaging with international television. The cultural aftershocks went well beyond streaming numbers, too. Halloween costume sales for the Guard uniforms spiked globally. Real-world pop-up experiences opened in multiple countries. And Netflix leaned into that momentum hard with a real-money reality competition spin-off. A decision that's genuinely interesting to sit with, because it takes a show that was built as a critique of people competing for survival money and turns it into an actual competition for money. Whether you read that as clever meta-commentary or as missing the show's own point is worth thinking about. and reasonable viewers land on both sides. On the industry level, Squid Game accelerated something that was already building. Korean film and television had been gaining international ground for years. Parasite's Oscar win in 2020, the growing global footprint of K-pop. But Squid Game pushed Korean content into mainstream, mass-market territory in a way nothing had before. Netflix subsequently increased its investment in Korean productions significantly, and other platforms followed. In that sense, Squid Game isn't just a hit show, it's an inflection point for how non-English content gets distributed and marketed globally. It's also worth being honest about where the show's sequel season struggled, because it's instructive. Season 1 had the advantage of surprise. Audiences didn't know what kind of show they were watching until they were already inside it. The tension was genuine because the rules and stakes felt unknown. Later seasons had to deliver on established expectations instead, which is a fundamentally different and harder creative problem. You can't recreate the shock of the unknown once the audience already knows what a Squid Game season looks like. That's part of why critical reception cooled slightly for the follow-ups, even as viewership numbers stayed strong. Familiarity and repeat viewership aren't the same thing as the impact of that first watch. So how should you actually evaluate this show 10 minutes in? The case for it is straightforward. Tight pacing, a premise that functions as both entertainment and pointed social commentary, character writing that earns its emotional beats instead of relying purely on shock value, and visual choices that hold up on rewatch. The case against it centers mainly on the violence. It's graphic and it's meant to be, because the show wants that violence to feel like a genuine cost rather than spectacle for its own sake. Go in with that understanding, and Squid Game holds up as one of the more purposeful and more successful uses of extreme content in recent television. A show that used a simple children's game as a lens for a very real, very global anxiety about what people will do when the systems around them stop working.